So, for group one, we began our discussion by acknowledging the hardships Punjabi immigrants face and the helplessness that they often feel. Um, Gibson says on page 86 that the reason why we don't do anything is because it is their country. And so the idea that the Punjabi doesn't speak up, not because they don't want to, but because they just don't feel comfortable, kind of spoke to a lot of us, especially as we begin to describe the immigrant students that we have in our own classrooms. There's this difference between males and females and American versus non-American born citizens. And for some, the idea of speaking up makes them fear that they're a target or that they're allowing for their families to become a target. We also saw this variation of cultural differences and various sense of belonging. But at the core of it was this sense of not truly belonging to where you live, and that was a common theme in this part of the discussion. Additionally, we found that, as Gibson said on page 5, immigrant students kind of felt like they must accept the behavior of school, which are quite different from those that govern them at home. And so it becomes this balancing act for many immigrant children. And we recognize the need for teachers to become more aware of the students' cultural differences that we may perceive as problems in the classroom that aren't. So things like speaking up when questions arise, answering the teacher when they call on you, looking adults in the eye when speaking. Um, Sometimes we as teachers feel like that's a issue in our classroom when really it's just a cultural difference that we kind of need to acknowledge. Um, and so that also comes to when we talk about parent conferences, usually as our discussion kind of went to this next point, which usually for Punjabis, the decision making process is joint, as Gibson points out on page 118. When they do kind of have to make a decision, it's not just the mom and the dad, it's the children will consult the parents. And so this led to a discussion of how teachers should make a conscious effort to have conferences at a time when both parents are available, if at all possible, and the need for teachers to kind of think about ways to help parents overcome language barriers and work schedules, public transportation, so that they're given a true opportunity to create a joint decision and not just one having all to say. And so Punjabi parents kind of really want their children to be able to support themselves when they grow up. And there's this question of how schools can better support students for success beyond school. For this part of the discussion, even though it began in the decision making, we went towards upholding this ability that parents supporting their student despite this desire to do so, and how some parents just didn't have that resource. So we kind of really acknowledged the fact that they had never even taken into account that some families didn't have the resources to give their kids real world experience, and thought about how schools can better discuss that. Um, we also came to the consensus that, as teachers, we should be there for all children, not just the majority. Although, when it came to addressing the situation of, like, some people actually felt powerless and didn't know what to do to bring it up. And then we went to talk about administrators and how they avoided conflict sometimes in the workplace. What it comes down to is that, as Gibson points out on page 6, students whose cultural and linguistics background differ from those of the dominant group in the society do not yet enjoy equal educational opportunities. And some of that is that the prejudice that the Valley Siders intensified, or the prejudice from the Valley Siders rather intensified because admin and teachers didn't know how to stop the disrespectful comments, disrespectful actions. One teacher even admitted that At her school, the Hispanic population felt unwelcome and unsafe, which kind of leads to them this feeling kind of transcending across student attitudes. And so, while in theory, having a safe and welcoming learning environment is the basic level of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, the reality is that a lot of times administration, like teachers, just appear resigned to the status quo. They felt kind of powerless to change it. And when things occurred in their classrooms and in their schools, while some seen this as this important opportunity to kind of take on this teachable moment to encourage cultural competence, other teachers in our discussion felt as if their students just kind of needed one-on-one redirection. And others kind of dismissed the idea through what they called ingrained ignorance. And while admitting that they were kind of non confrontational, so they didn't really want to avoid bringing up the issues in their school. And so it's no wonder that this next topic reminds us that this climate of prejudice permeates the high school experience of Punjabi students, as pointed out on Gibson on page 142. Um, at this point in our discussion, we just kind of acknowledge that this climate of prejudice affects the enjoyment, participation, and outcomes of one's education. And for some, the discussion even trigger hurtful memories of experience that they faced as a child. And so we decided that we really hope that we pushed ourselves to be better teachers so that we can show this generation how much stronger love and tolerance is, and to reach students and to learn from other cultures and viewpoints. Um, but the reality is we kind of acknowledge that sometimes it takes a little bit more courage to kind of speak up as opposed to just looking the other way. Um, and the Valley Side Punjabis encourage their children to kind of adopt the good ways of the Americans. And to them, this means work hard to become economically independent and to achieve education that lays the foundation for success later in life. And so, as we move towards this concept of discussion, we recognize that this key distinction kind of allows Punjabi to fit into the American dream. Um, and so it actually allows them a little bit of the success that they experience, regardless of this misplaced angers that some of the Valley Siders exhibit, such as Miss Nelson. And so we basically just drew this conclusion that generalizations and stereotypes were common crutches that people use in society when trying to conceptualize groups of people that they're unfamiliar with. But it is also our job as educators to challenge our students and colleagues to look past those stereotypes. And so this positive sense of identity that the Punjabis had, we just really wanted to make sure that we could replicate that with our other immigrant groups.